Hello and welcome everyone to lesson 20 in this Chess Beginner to Winner series. And today I'll talk a little bit about some Paul Morphy chess strategy because you can never go wrong studying the games of Paul Morphy, especially all you beginners out there. He is one of the players I would really take a look at when you're learning chess. He was one of the greatest players of the mid 1800s, and his games are definitely worth taking a look at. So, this game, Morphy had the white pieces, and he's playing a German master, Daniel Harwitz, and the game took place in 1858 in Paris, France. So let's take a look at this. When I ran the game review, it looks like Morphy played at a 94.6% accuracy versus his opponent at 84.1%. And no brilliant moves, but Morphy had two great moves. His opponent had one. No blunders, one miss, and they both had two mistakes, but one miss by Harwitz, and he had four inaccuracies versus two by Morphy. Okay, so let's jump into this. We'll take a look at the analysis here. So the game begins with e4, e5. Morphy was pretty well known for some great attacking games and great combinations. And in this game, he plays a little more strategically, and it's a longer game. So, e4, e5, standard stuff. You both put your pawns in the center. These e4, e5 games tend to be a little more tactical, depending what variations are played. They, could end up becoming strategic as well, but more tactical than d4, d5 games usually. So knight to f3, Morphy just immediately developing his knight, attacking this pawn in the center, controlling central squares, and his opponent responds with d6, the Philidor defense. They're playing in Paris, and the Philidor defense is named after a great French chess master, André Philidor, who had a great saying that pawns were the soul of chess. So he felt that pawns, were very important in chess, and we'll see, that applies definitely in this game as well. So d6 basically just fortifies this pawn that's under attack on e5. The only downside is that this bishop is blocked in here, and a lot of times black wants to eventually push this d pawn to d5. So, why not push it, all the way to d5 in one move later in the game? So that, those could be downsides. The blocked in bishop and the pawn taking more than one move to go to d5. So anyway, Morphy responds by, taking control in the center, pushing his d pawn in one move, two squares forward. Now there's an attack building up on this e5 pawn, with the pawn attacking and the knight attacking. Morphy's opponent responds by just capturing, releasing the pressure here in the center of the board, and just, taking this d pawn. And Morphy responds by recapturing with the queen. So a bold move by Morphy here, because with the queen here, it could be attacked by knight to c6. Although, this bishop could move up and pin that knight, possibly, to prevent the knight from capturing the queen. But with this queen centralized here, it controls a lot of squares. It's aimed at the king side. This bishop cannot develop immediately because otherwise the queen would capture on g7 and then threaten the rook. So Uh, Horowitz plays knight to f6, blocking this line on the g pawn by the queen, adding more pressure to White's e pawn, and just developing, helping control squares, the important squares in the center of the board, and getting closer to being able to castle once this bishop is developed. So Morphy, he uses an interesting strategy here. Generally, you do not want to move pieces twice in the opening unless you have a good reason. So even the computer recommends that just bishop to c4 is best. Developing the bishop, getting ready to castle. But this interesting pawn push by Morphy attacks the knight, and it's attacking this pawn as well. But let's see how his opponent responds here. So the opponent just captures with the pawn here. Now Morphy could just recapture with the queen with check, but then his opponent could just develop a bishop and block here, or even block with the queen. But in this game, instead of capturing the pawn, Morphy immediately exchanges off queens, heading for an endgame. So this is one strategy you can use if you are more of an endgame player or you like endgames. You can try and trade off queens early and go more quickly into an endgame, especially if you have some type of advantage. But here, the only advantage, I guess, that this strategy would achieve, and it's not bad either, is that now the king has to recapture here. And so black's king is stuck in the center. And now, after Morphy recaptures his pawn, well, now there's a threat of this fork here, capturing on f7, forking the king and the rook. So Morphy's opponent, instead of moving the king again, develops the bishop, covers this f pawn, and now black has two pieces developed to Morphy's one knight here. So Morphy continues his development, playing the best move, knight to c3 here. And now both sides continue just pushing pieces out, developing them off the back rank. So here, this is a good strategy to develop and attack at the same time. So now the bishop is developed out to the strong central square, attacking the knight. But Morphy retreats and attacks at the same time. And although the knight can be captured here, which is what happens, well, now we see that the bishop pair is going to be lost by Morphy's opponent. So another valuable strategy when you're playing chess is try to knock out your your opponent's bishop pair, because especially in this position where the board's wide open, if you have the bishop pair that covers all the squares on the board and the board's wide open, those bishops can just crisscross all over the board, attacking this way and that, and they could cause a lot of damage. So if you're able to knock out one of those bishops like Morphy just did here, well, now Morphy has this light squared bishop and his opponent does not have that piece. So now that Morphy has that extra bishop, it kind of gives him an advantage in attacking. So immediately after capturing, he's also attacking this unprotected pawn here. So the opponent, instead of just covering that pawn with a passive rook move, he immediately moves his rook to this open file. Another strategy that you want to play often in chess is placing your rooks on open ranks files where they have more mobility. So that rook wasn't doing much in the corner. Now he's activated here in the center. This is a developing move, and it also attacks the king. So Morphy just blocks with the bishop here. So a very good strategy of, and this was the best move in the position. Whenever you have a chance to make a move that achieves more than one goal, that can usually be a very good idea to do that. So here he not only blocks the attack, but he develops this bishop to a good square where it's attacking along two different diagonals, covering a central square on d4. So now we have king to e7, a mistake by Morphy's opponent. And now the game jumps to +1 in favor of white. And, that's because, one, this wasn't a very good move, blocking your own rook here. But now we have, the bishop pair for Morphy. Pretty soon he'll be able to activate both of his rooks. His opponent still has a knight that needs to be developed, before he can even get out his other rook. And it looks like knight to g4 would have been better. So if we go back and take a look at that, the best move to keep the game closer to even but still slightly in white's favor is to just play knight to g4 to try and pick off and get rid of Morphy's bishop pair. So here it looks like, let's see, you would think that he would want to move up his king possibly. That way if there's a capture, the pawn can recapture and be protected. But it looks like the computer says the best move is to just go ahead and castle queenside, activate the other rook, pin this bishop to the king, and then of course after knight captures, then we would have pawn captures, and it looks like this rook recapturing the pawn is the third best move. The computer recommends knight to d7, just developing this knight that's not doing anything but blocking in the rook, or knight to f6, or not knight, but pawn to f6, because this bishop is attacking this pawn as well. So, I guess that's why you can let this pawn fall, because you'll be able to pick off this pawn, this f pawn. So, if the rook captures, then the bishop would capture here. But after f6, if we take a look at that, now we have Morphy with the possibility of doing the same or a similar type of maneuver, moving the knight up, and this would give him a slight edge, attacking the bishop with the rook. So, if the king moves forward here, now what does it recommend? Just rook to d3, protecting this pawn here. All right, so before we dive too deep into some sideline, let's go back here, and I'll go back a little bit further. Okay, so the bishop developed attacking this pawn. Instead of protecting the pawn, the rook makes a great move, checking the king. Morphy blocks that with the bishop, and now the king moves over to protect this pawn. Okay, so we see why he moved there, just to protect the pawn. Instead, we saw that attacking the bishop here would have been better. Okay, so after the king move, now this gives Morphy the opportunity to go ahead and castle long anyway here. And we have a6, preventing the knight from being able to jump up here and attack the bishop. and the knight can't move to the center, or this knight will just capture. Well, now we have bishop to g5 here by Morphy. So the best move in the position. White is ahead here. The knight is now pinned to the king. And it looks like at this point, knight to d7 is played, which is an inaccuracy. We see why this is played, just to back up the knight. That way the king wouldn't have to come out and recapture, or the pawn. The pawns wouldn't be doubled if the pawn captured. But it looks like king to f8 would have been better, just to move the king back out of the way of the rook. And then I guess if that happened, the pawns would be doubled. So we see why Morphy's opponent did not want to break his pawns over here, and why he moved his king to this awkward square. All right, so moving on, we have knight to e4. So Morphy just adds more pressure to the knight on f6, and the knight cannot be captured, of course, because of this pin by the bishop. So we see Morphy's strategy here. He just finds weak spots in the position and just adds pressure by bringing all his pieces into the attack here. So, the opponent tries to force the issue here, attacking the bishop, but it looks like it would have been better just to move this other bishop to b4 here, which would kind of limit the scope of the knight and prevent the knight from just being able to capture the bishop. So moving on, Morphy decides to give up his bishop pair. So we have a capture, and it looks like it would have been better, instead of giving up the bishop pair, for the knight to just go ahead and capture on d7. So we can take a look at that. Now, we have to think here, Morphy, he's playing this game back in 1858. He was also very young at this time. I think he might have been about 20 years old or so. So maybe even 19, 20. I'm not sure. I would have to look that up. So he's still learning here, and he's still learning strategy and everything, and improving his chess. But he's keeping up with the top chess masters in the world and defeating them. So, a pretty interesting, achievement by Morphy to be able to accomplish all this at such a young age, and back before we had computers and the internet to help us with our chess. All right, so let's see here. We have a capture. Getting rid, Morphy gives up his bishop pair, starts attacking. The knight attacks, but now the other bishop is picked off. So here we begin to see Morphy's strategy. He, instead of just picking off another, exchanging, if we go back here, instead of just making an even exchange with the knight here, and then the king could possibly just recapture and avoid breaking the pawns apart, well, then the game would be left with opposite colored bishops. So another interesting chess strategy is the theory that revolves around opposite colored bishops. When you have opposite colored bishops, the games are more likely to end in a draw because of these opposite colored bishops, because the bishops can oppose each other. They each control different colored squares, of course, but then that limits the opponent and also limits you on your options, because if you have the dark squared bishop and your opponent puts all his pawns on the light squares, well then your bishop is like a ghost, just moving through the chessboard but unable to touch any of the pawns if they're all on the light squares. And if all of your opponent's pieces are on the opposite colored squares of your bishop, well, then that bishop really can't do much but maybe blockade or cover squares or access to those dark squares, but you're really limited. And so opposite colored bishops usually end in draws more often. So Morphy, he probably realizes this, so he picks off his opponent's bishop instead, which now, because the rook is also covering this square, the pawn is forced to capture. And so now he's given his opponent an isolated pawn here. And that is another chess strategy that's very important. Whenever you're able to give your opponent an isolated pawn like this, you usually want to trade off as many pieces as you can because it becomes harder and harder to protect this passed pawn this isolated pawn, which doesn't have any pawns beside it to protect it, like these other pawns here on the sides. So this can become a weakness. And we'll see what Morphy does next in the game and how he tries to create and go after weaknesses and use that strategy to defeat his opponent ultimately. All right, so Morphy develops his final piece that was not doing anything in the corner with a check on the king and taking control of this open E file here. And that's what you want to do with your rooks. Put them on open files or half open files. So now we have the rook attacking this isolated pawn. And another strategy with isolated pawns is to control the square in front of them so they cannot move up the board. So now we have the bishop and the rook teaming up to control this d5 square and prevent that pawn from pushing up the board and trying to exchange off and get rid of this possible weakness by exchanging for the c pawn here. All right, so the king retreats back, which the computer says is the best move, and Morphy continues to trade off pieces, giving his opponent less of an army to help protect this isolated pawn. So now we have an interesting move, of course, which is the best. Another, I guess, side effect of Black's awkward position and this isolated pawn is that the rook is not able to move over and take control of this open file. The knight had to retreat to protect this isolated pawn. So now this gives Morphy time to continue with whatever plan he decides here. So he blockades the isolated pawn and attacks this b pawn at the same time. And the computer says that's an inaccuracy, that it would have been better just to move the rook up to d3 here, where it would have more mobility, because from d3, the rook would be able to move all along this third rank and just start attacking pawns, wherever he felt like. From here on d3, he could swing over here and put pressure on the queenside pawns. He could team up with his bishop, move over here and put pressure on this f pawn. But you get the idea. But Morphy instead decides to blockade the pawn and attack this b pawn here. So the opponent plays the best move, rook to b8, just protecting that pawn instead of pressing forward, although he'll end up doing that later in the game. Okay, so now the pawn retreats to keep an eye on this b pawn, but the computer says that's a good move, but slightly better would have been g3. So why would g3 be a good move? Well, one reason is that it's often a good strategy to place your pawns on the opposite colored squares of, or excuse me, opposite colored squares of your bishop. So if the bishop is a light squared bishop, a lot of times it's good to put your pawns on the dark squares. That way your bishop can maneuver through the pawns and not be blocked in by them, as the bishop is blocked here. All right, so now we have g6. So the computer says this is an inaccuracy. Now the game is +1 in Morphy's favor. Better would have been to bring the king out towards the center to help guard this pawn. And also, by playing g6, Morphy's opponent is committing another possible error in strategy, where a lot of times it's a good idea to put your pawns on the opposite colored squares of your opponent's bishop, because then they cannot come under attack. But I will have to say that there could be exceptions. You kind of have to calculate and feel the position, because one good reason you may want to put your pawns on the same colored square as your opponent's bishop is that it takes squares away from your opponent. So now, the bishop could not move up here to h5 or f5. So, you could block the bishop a little bit. So this is kind of double-edged. You can put your pawns on the same colored squares as the bishop to block the bishop's maneuverability, but on the other hand, they could be easier targets of attack if they're on the same colored squares as the bishop. So that's something you kind of have to just learn and feel by experience as you play in different chess positions. All right, so now we have c3 played by Morphy. So he pushes a pawn forward. That could limit this half-open file here in case the rook eventually moves onto this file. It could help slow down any progress of this pawn, and it moves a pawn to a square on the opposite color of his bishop, and the king can possibly move forward and go up into the position, especially on the queen side here. Morphy may have the strategy of running his king up the board and trying to help attack these pawns with the bishop. So finally, king to e7 is played. And another strategy in the endgame in chess is to bring your kings out into the position, because we see there are limited number of pieces in the endgame and every piece counts. So, especially the kings. The kings can become very strong in the end game. All right, so we have a check here by Morphy, forcing the black king to make a decision. Does he go into the center, or does he stay over here to protect these kingside pawns? And he decides to stay over by the pawns here. And now we have Morphy moving his king forward, getting ready to jump up in the action here. So the game continues with this knight moving to c7, which is the best move, and that could possibly help push this pawn forward, although this could be dangerous, putting the pawn on this d5 square where the bishop would be able to target it. But knight to c7, from here the knight can kind of jump into the center of the board, hopefully. So the game continues with Morphy maneuvering his king up here on the queen side, getting ready to try and help his bishop attack these pawns. So now the knight repositions here to block this rook on the open file. Another strategy, you can use your pieces to cut off access of an open file by your opponent's rook by placing your knight here, bishop, or whatever. Just, well, I shouldn't say whatever. If you put a rook there, that's possible as well. Of course, you can't put a queen there, but you can use your pieces to limit the scope of your opponent's rook on the open file. So continuing on, Morphy just runs his king up the side of the board here, trying to help his bishop attack. And finally, Horowitz pushes his b pawn forward, getting it off of the light colored squares so they cannot be targeted any longer by this bishop. This b pawn can't. And the game continues with b4 here. So Morphy pushes his pawn once again onto a dark square, maybe giving his king a little escape hole and limiting the scope of the knight. So another chess strategy is to cut off the squares available to your opponent's knight. So if we take a look at this position right here, Morphy has cut off this c5 square for the knight, which would have been able to check the king, and drive the king back, because now the pawns are cutting off these squares forward here for the king. And also we have the c pawn cutting off the knight from moving to d4. And so, what else could be played by this knight? He could jump over here and attack the bishop, but the bishop could just run away. If he moves down here, this pawn is covered by the bishop, and maybe the knight could try and jump here, but the rook could move up to e3 and help cover this d3 square in case the knight tries to move forward. In this position also, we see that there are pawns on both sides of the board. So this bishop is going to be stronger because it can more quickly move back and forth across the board compared to the knight. So it's good that the knight is in the center, because from the center, you'll have the best chance of getting to one side or the other in case you need to do that in a hurry. So the game continues with h5. So that does further limit the scope of the bishop, but now all these pawns are on the light squares and they could become a target by this bishop, this light squared bishop. So moving on, Morphy plays h4 to lock in these pawns on the light squares. So now, I guess this pawn could push forward, and then Morphy would have to decide what to do, whether to capture or just protect the pawn with a g3 pawn move. But this is another strategy. If your opponent moves a pawn to a light square and you can jump a pawn in front of it and fix that pawn on the same colored square as your bishop, then it can become a target in the future, as it is kind of locked in on that light square. All right, so now the king once again tries to jump into the center and get into the action here. So what does Morphy do? He moves this rook up here where it may have a little bit more mobility in the future. But now the computer is saying that, even though that was an excellent move, bishop to d5 may have been better. Now we have king to d7, the best move in the position. The black king is trying to head over to help fight maybe this pawn majority here, kind of a pawn majority, 3 versus 2, but black still does have this central isolated pawn here. So moving on, the bishop does find d5 here, the best move. And then the game continues with the rook lining up here, maybe to oppose Morphy's rook in the future. So now we have the king retreating back because he cannot go forward. So he has to reposition down here to b3 and then try and maybe move up towards the center of the board. Maybe Horowitz is not sure what to do. So he just retreats his rook off of this open rank here, or sorry, open e file, and is probably deciding to push this pawn forward and have it backed up by the rook, and then maybe he can gain access to the g file here. So what does Morphy do? He decides to move his rook. He finds the best move, targeting this pawn, threatening to capture with a check. So his opponent plays the best move, protecting the pawn. And now we have a4. Morphy gains some space here on the queen side, just marching his pawns up the board. And it says that's an excellent move, but g3 might have been a little bit better. So now, to keep things a little bit even, a5 is played, which is good, but g5 immediately here would have been better to target this pawn, maybe give more scope to the rook. If Morphy would capture, the knight could recapture and attack here. Although, well, that's possible, but that could cause issues with the bishop lining up here, because now we have the bishop lined up on this pawn with the rook, and then the rook is lined up with the bishop as well. So anyway, moving on, we have a capture here by Morphy, and this is a mistake, which gives away some of Morphy's edge here. Rook to d3 would have been better to just line up on the isolated pawn. But now, king captures, and this was a miss. So now, Morphy is definitely ahead here with a bigger advantage of over +1. So what should Morphy's opponent have done? What should he have done? He should have captured with the pawn, and that would keep the game close to even, because now he would have his own, he wouldn't have any passed pawns, but he would have these strong central pawns that could help each other move forward possibly, and the game would have been a lot more even, and who knows, it probably could have been a lot closer to a draw in this position. So how might it continue? Let's see. It looks like the computer recommends rook to g3, king. Well, now it's saying the king should have moved up into the action at this point. So the computer is not quite sure. I will delete this move and put the king move back in and see what it says. King to c4. Yeah, now it's wanting the rook move again, so I guess the computer is not quite sure here. Now it's recommending rook to c8 check. So that's a possible downside to that move. Although now the king could march up to here and put pressure on this pawn possibly. All right. Well, before diving, into that too crazy, let's go back here. So a4 was played. Now we have the exchange of the minor pieces, and the king recaptures. So we'll see why this is a mistake. Well, we still have this isolated pawn, which could be a problem. If the f pawn would have recaptured, it would get rid of the isolated pawn, and the two pawns side by side could kind of help each other. And the game continued with king to c4 by Morphy. So he moves forward here, and that's the best move. And now we have g5, another mistake by the opponent. So better would have been A takes on B4. So this, and then a recapture. But now Morphy would have this pawn majority, so that's probably why our opponent didn't do that. But let's see. Now it's saying rook to A8, putting pressure on this A pawn is the best move. And then, but even if that was played, the king could march up here protecting and threatening to capture this, and then have this passed pawn over here. Okay, so after king to c4, we had this pawn push to g5. Morphy ignores that and marches over here attacking these weak pawns. Now we have a capture, which is best. Recapture, also the best. And now a capture over here, which is best. But this allows Morphy to play the best move to recapture here. And now we have 2 passed pawns by Morphy. And it's +2 in Morphy's favor. And he should be winning here. Although, black has this passed pawn in the center. So after check, which is excellent, but rook to a8 is preferred by the computer. Now we have this great move, which I don't know how great it is. The computer sometimes exaggerates, I think. But the king moves down here to a5 to protect this pawn. And the rook is cutting this king off here, has it blocked on the A file. But that shouldn't be too much of a problem because the pawn can push forward and the king could find an escape hole here. So the game continues with black trying to get his king into the center to do something. But this is an inaccuracy. Rook to a8 checking would have been better. But at this point, Morphy is ahead and he's probably winning. So if we go back and look at what the computer wanted, rook to a8, then king to b5, rook to b8. But now the king can just move out of here and use his pawns to cover from any future checks. But after d5, this allows the pawn to start moving. We have king to b3, and now let's see, rook to g8, putting pressure on the g pawn here. And it looks like the best thing for white to do is just ignore that and start pushing his passed pawns. Okay, back to the action in the game. After king to a5, we had black trying to move forward, which this is usually a good strategy to get your king up here in the center in the endgame in the middle of the action. But now we have a check here. So the king moves, threatening to capture with the rook and the king piling up here, and also allowing white the opportunity to pick off this pawn, which is what Morphy does, and that's the best move. And now we have a capture here, although it looks like f5 would have been a little bit better. But at this point, Morphy is winning. So let's see how he continues and wins the game. So Morphy plays this move, which is an excellent move. The material is even, but Morphy has this huge advantage of this outside passed pawn here. So the game continues, and let's go back and see what the computer said would have been better. Looks like the computer prefers rook to b6. So moving the rook over here and attacking, which would, so this is what the computer preferred. If this happens, there's no way to save this rook. Well, there's no way to prevent it. You have to capture. You could either move here, But then if the white rook captures, the king would be back here behind the pawn. If you capture up here, well then the king would recapture and the pawn would start marching forward and win here. So Morphy is pretty much winning at this point. But in the game, let's see what was played here. So we had rook to d4 with check. The king captures, allowing white to capture, and now the a pawn is free to move forward. So black starts pushing his pawns. Although it would have been better if we take a look at this. F5 is excellent, but the king move down to attack the pawns would have been better. But it doesn't matter here because this white pawn would be promoting much faster. So Morphy, he plays this f4 move, which is excellent, but just pushing the pawn immediately would have been better. And this kind of slows down this f pawn from moving forward. And so now we have the king playing the best move here to e3 to attack this pawn. And Morphy just starts marching his pawn up the board. So the king goes after the g pawn. Morphy marches forward. And after capture, now Morphy's opponent is marching his passed pawn down towards the queening square. But we have a8 queen with check. So the king moves and Morphy plays here, which is best, to f3. So this really limits what the king can do here. And the game ended. Morphy's opponent resigned here. And we'll see how the game may have progressed. So let's take a look at some of the options. The computer says that the game may have gone on like this. So h4, which I don't know. You think he would just march this pawn up to h2 immediately. So we'll take a look at that. But first, let's see what the computer says. It says h4 is best, and then capture. But white would just be winning because all the pawns would start getting picked off here. The king would go up here. The queen could cover. And then, yeah, that would just be completely winning. So let's take a look at, after this queen to f3 move, why this move would be bad. So after this, we have queen to g3 here with check. And so if you have queen to h1, so I'll show you that real quick. Queen to h1 would lead to a mate in 2 here. After queen to f2, completely blocking in the king, and the pawn can't move. This other pawn would have to move, and then it would be a mate on f1. So if we go back and look at king to f1 here, well, now we have the queen just picking off this pawn, and from here the queen would pick off the other pawns, and or just move the king in and mate. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed some of these strategies that we pointed out here. As a review, I'll go over some of them. So if you can hold the bishop pair and keep the bishop pair, that's usually a good long-term strategy, because especially if you have the bishop pair and your opponent does not, well then, the bishop you have, whether it's one or both bishops, they'll cover a lot of squares that your opponent will not be able to if they don't have their bishop pair. And so the player with the bishop pair can usually use that to advantage for an attack. And then also opposite colored bishops. If the game goes down into an endgame and there are opposite colored bishops, well, then one side or the other could put, or both, could put all their pieces on the opposite colored squares of their opponent's bishop. And then the bishop would be like a ghost maneuvering through, but not able to touch any of the pieces. So, opposite colored bishop endgames, they tend to be a lot more drawish. So, we saw why Morphy chose to pick off his opponent's bishop. And then he had another advantage. When there are pieces on both sides of the board, especially pawns on both sides of the board, I should say, when there's pawns on both sides of the board, the bishop is quicker and more able to get across from one side of the board to the other, and will have an advantage over a knight that is much slower in moving from one side to the other. So if it's an open position with pawns on both sides of the board, the bishop usually has an advantage over a knight. Let's see, what else did we cover? Other strategies. Trying to take control of the open files for your rooks. That's usually a good strategy because, if rooks are better attacking and counterattacking pieces, they don't do as well just guarding pawns as we saw earlier in this game. Maybe I can go back to it. Let's see. Yeah, earlier in the game, there was a point where black was pretty much just guarding a pawn up here. Anyway, at some point, I think the rook was just stuck. Well, even here, he's stuck playing guard duty on this b7 pawn. So look how limited he is. Well, right now, he can't move at all without giving up this pawn. And he can only really go back and forth on these four squares, and he can't even move forward. Whereas white, Morphy, his rook, is able to go up and down this open E file. He could also move all the way across the first rank here. So, excuse me, another good strategy is put your rooks on open files or half open files. Here the computer's saying it's good to put it on this half open file and target this isolated pawn. So that's another strategy, the strategy of the isolated pawn in chess. So if you or your opponent has an isolated pawn, well, the isolated pawn does better when there are many pieces to help protect it and help it push forward. So one advantage of the isolated pawn is that a lot of times, well, I guess all the time, there will be no pawns on either side of it. And then you can use those open or half open files on each side of that pawn for your rooks or your queen and give them access into the enemy's position. But you have to be careful not to exchange off all your pieces, or that isolated pawn could become a weakness in the end game. And if you need to get rid of the isolated pawn because it's becoming a weakness, you want to try and push that pawn forward. So the side that is blockading or trying to stop the progress of that isolated pawn that's trying to push forward and maybe trade off for this C pawn, the defender, or excuse me, I guess the attacker who's trying to get to that isolated pawn, you want to limit the movement of that isolated pawn. So a good way to attack an isolated pawn is to take control of the square in front of the isolated pawn by, this bishop is attacking. You could blockade with a knight, just put a knight in front of that pawn so it can't move. But once you've taken control of the square in front of an isolated pawn, you've immobilized your target, and then you can line up pieces on that pawn and try and keep applying pressure until hopefully you can knock that isolated pawn out and capture it, unless they have enough defenders to cover it. But that's another point. If they're using all their pieces to defend that pawn, they're just playing defense the whole time while you are slowly improving the position of your pieces and attacking. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this Morphy game and some of the strategies that he used to win, because Morphy usually attacks and has more tactical games with more combinations, but this was a more strategic game for Morphy. So, he was probably developing his strategy as he played more and more opponents and, as he got better in chess. All right, if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Feel free to leave comments or suggestions or any requests on subjects for future chess videos. Thank you for watching, everyone, and have a super chess day.